want me to sit here?
You should sit in the middle. I will stay here and maybe I'll move.
I'll stand here and I'll go down, so just be the two of you here.
Then I will go to the other side of the...
Okay.
And
I think it'll be the most interesting. Yeah, it's okay.
Right, okay?
Yes. I'll get a few ideas out and we have more discussion.
Yes, yes. The students generally are not shy in asking questions. My role is only to ask the first, that people don't go immediately, but I want the students to be able to address you the questions. And we now can turn our masks off as we're sitting.
Settle down. Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Mark Maloney. I'm the Executive Director and Acting Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. And I'm delighted that so many of you are here today to join us, both here in this amphitheater, but also online this afternoon for an event featuring Microsoft's President Brad Smith. Dear Brad, on behalf of Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this prestigious Boutimi Amphitheater, named after the man who founded Sciences Po some 149 years ago. And it's a great honor to have you with us today. I will shortly ask Professor Cornelia Wall to introduce today's event and our guest of honor more fully. But first, I just wanted to say a few words about the developing partnership between PSIA, Sciences Po, and Microsoft. We were very pleased that Microsoft agreed to be the exclusive corporate sponsor of PSIA's Youth and Leaders Summit in January 2021, the one that took place this past year. This summit is our annual flagship event, which brings together international experts with PSIA students for high-level intergenerational exchanges around a key global theme. And the 2021 edition focused on wars and peace, solving conflicts and building human security. It was a tremendous success, involving some 50 distinguished guests in a mix of keynote sessions and panel discussions, which attracted more than 3,000 connections over the 3-day summit. Building on this initial success, I'm delighted to confirm that this partnership will continue throughout 2022 with Microsoft's sponsorship of a series of interactive lectures that will explore some of the most prevalent challenges in cyberspace, including those relating to cybersecurity and cyber diplomacy. The lectures will feature prominent speakers from the public and the private sectors, but also from civil society and from academia. And students and other participants will be engaged in interactive discussions, drawing on a diverse range of perspectives. So today's event on the critical challenges in cybersecurity and digital sovereignty promises to be the perfect kickstart to this lecture series. Dear Brad, on behalf of Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs, let me thank you and Microsoft for the support and engagement with this very exciting collaboration on such important and timely topic. Let me now hand the floor over to Professor Cornelia Wall, who is a professor of political science and the president of Sciences Po's academic board. She founded and co-directed 2 research units and has published widely on business and government relations. Dear Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's my great honor to introduce Brad Smith today, President and Vice Chair of Microsoft. Brad Smith has been working for Microsoft for 28 years now, if I'm not mistaken, initially as the head of corporate and legal affairs in Europe, based in Paris. So it is fitting for us to welcome you back home. And since we're a university, and by definition, interested in degrees, I will also mention that you're not only an alumnus of Princeton and Columbia Law School, but that you have also studied in Europe international law and economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So if our colleagues and students are watching, it's a quick shout out to Geneva as well. Brad Smith became Microsoft's general counsel in 2002 and has often been presented as Microsoft's top lawyer in the past. And since there may be students in the room who do not know what a general counsel is, let me, for 5 minutes, 2, I could do shorter, just explain what exactly that means. A general counsel is not only the top legal executive in a company. It is the person that really develops and holds together a company's strategy in a changing political environment and that represents the company and policy decisions. And we know one thing for sure, technology companies really are facing very quickly changing political environments. For a company the importance of Microsoft, this means working on all issues related to the intersection of technology and society, from data ownership, privacy, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity to environmental sustainability, human rights, and immigration. A vast portfolio for which Brad Smith leads over 1,500 people in business, legal, and corporate affairs in 54 countries. We are able to catch up with you between two important events, the Glasgow Climate Change Conference COP26 and the Paris Peace Forum, where you're heading tomorrow or the day after to speak with you about cyber diplomacy. Cyber diplomacy, cybersecurity, and digital sovereignty are issues that are central to your work. You have warned about the vulnerabilities of the digital world we live in for many years, including in the best-selling book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age, written with Caroline Brown, who's also with us today. You urge tech companies to take responsibility for the future they create, and governments to take seriously the challenges of these new technologies that can easily turn into weapons in cyber war, a platform for cybercrime, a vector of social inequality, and an ethical challenge for individuals as much as for democracies and our political institutions. In line with these convictions, Microsoft has pledged $20 billion to battle cyber attacks, and this is a sign that makes it very clear that private companies and governments need to join hands to address the challenges of international and domestic security in the digital age. We're very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Very much.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I have brought some colleagues from Microsoft, and I look out and I feel like it was only yesterday that I was sitting in your seat thinking about what I would do with the rest of my life. And I thought what I would do this evening is hopefully make this worth your while and your time. Not talk for too long, because I think the conversation and listening to and answering your questions will be much more interesting than having me just talk. But maybe framing this with a few initial thoughts. Talk a little bit about digital sovereignty and where it's going. Talk a little bit about cybersecurity, and talk a little bit then about cyber diplomacy. And what the heck is somebody from a company doing talking about any of these things? But first, I would sort of start with, in some ways, the fact of life for us that is so obvious that we don't really even talk about it at all. When people ask you, where are you from? Probably the first thing you say is the name of the country that you've come from. After all, when we chatted, the first thing people said is there are students from 110 countries here at Sciences Po. What an extraordinary thing. The world comes together. But think about the world that comes together here. It is divided into territories. Each territory is a country. Each country is led by a government, and the government exercises sovereignty over that territory. And that is the world in which people have lived literally mostly since the Peace of Westphalia, roughly 400 years ago. That is still the world that exists today. What does sovereignty mean? Well, I think it really means that within each territory, a government has the power to decide who will be taxed and how much, what the law will be and how people will need to obey it, how it will be adjudicated in the courts, how the foreign affairs of that country are managed. That's sovereignty as it has existed for 400 years. So why are we now talking about digital sovereignty, and what is that? Well, I think what it reflects in the first instance is we also live in an era where digital technology has become ubiquitous. For all of you, you've probably used it for as long as you can remember. It's how you organize your life. It's how you manage your work as students. It's how you entertain yourself. It's how you stay in touch, no doubt, with your families. Virtually everything you do in all likelihood with the use of digital technology. And as digital technology has grown, as it has become so ubiquitous, people have realized that it doesn't necessarily stay confined to a single territory. It reminds me of railroad tracks that go from one country to the next. In this case, it's like the digital tracks in the sky or in cyberspace, the name we've given it, that just keeps going around and around and around the world. Some countries have exercised more control, they've imposed more restraints, but in so many ways, digital technology has in some ways challenged traditional notions of sovereignty, the ability of a government to manage what goes on within its territory. And so it actually makes good sense that here in the third decade of the 21st century, governments are asking anew, how do we ensure that we remain in control of our digital sovereignty? As I travel around Europe or work around the world, or literally at a company like Microsoft, every single day, the incoming issues really involve a few common themes when it comes to digital sovereignty. The first is national security. A country can no longer protect its national security unless it can preserve its cybersecurity. And so that, in some ways, is the starting place for many countries. But there's then quickly a second aspect as well. How do countries protect the rights of their citizens, especially in a field like data privacy? Especially when data might leave a country, it might be accessed by a government in another, or it might simply be used by a company in ways that citizens don't want, or the government doesn't desire. And then there's a third piece as well. It's really fundamental to economic growth. When you have a small number of very large tech companies, and Microsoft is obviously one of them, governments ask, what does this mean for our own economy? What does it mean for our tech sector? How can we make it bigger? But really what they're asking is, what does it mean for every sector? Because every sector of the economy needs to use digital technology and needs to put data to work. So we're now seeing the evolution of digital sovereignty as a topic. I'm sure you're studying it here. Governments are debating it. We at Microsoft are asking, how do we contribute to it? It really starts with a recognition that we need to adapt. It's interesting, if you think about the connection, the tension, or sometimes even the conflict between certain companies and industries and then sovereignty, I would say that 3 times in history we've seen industries grow so large and important that people in government worried that the industry had become larger than the government itself. The first was in the 1800s, and it was the railroad. The United States illustrates this very well. The country was divided into states, and then suddenly railroad tracks were laid, and the trains started going. They'd start in one state, and by the evening it might have gone into 4 more. They reshaped everything, much as digital technology does today. The states tried to regulate railroads, but they soon found that they couldn't be effective if they could only regulate them within their state. So they started to try to apply their policies to the activities of the railroads in other states as well, and the result was a little bit of chaos. So much so that in the 1880s, the United States Supreme Court said that the only government that could regulate railroads on a national basis was, not surprisingly, the national government. And from that decision, within a year, the modern regulatory state was really born in the United States in Washington, D.C. The first agency that was created was called the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was founded in 1886, and it had one purpose: to regulate railroads. In the eyes of some, the railroads became bigger than the government, so the power of the government literally grew, so it would be bigger than the railroads. We saw it again in the 20th century, and in the 20th century, I think the industry was not railroads. It was banks. It was financial services. When you think back, if you study the Great Depression, which became a global depression in the 1930s, it had at its origin a financial crash, a deeper financial crash than the world had experienced before, and it led to concerns about the practices of lending, of borrowing, of banking. And the result was in the 1930s to turn banks into a regulated industry. Oh, not every aspect was regulated, but there were new controls put in place. There were new agencies that would manage the money supply. Banks themselves would have to report more publicly. There would be transparency to seek to avoid the excesses that had created the depression in the first place. So a second time, we saw an industry grow larger in importance in the eyes of some than government, and the power of government expanded to reassert control. I've been saying inside Microsoft for a few years now that, in my opinion, the 2020s will do for technology what the 1930s did for banks, for understandable reasons and even good reasons. Whenever you have a technology that becomes so important, that becomes so ubiquitous, that is embedded in every part of society, I think people rightly ask, has this technology, has this industry become bigger than the power of the law itself? And I happen to believe, as a bedrock belief, in part reflecting where I grew up, but I think a principle that you see in most countries and in every democracy, this: no one should be above the law. No person should be above the law. No company should be above the law. No technology should be above the law. No industry should be above the law. And when there is concern about that happening, the essence of sovereignty is to reassert the power of the law. But of course, this isn't the United States in the 1880s. Oh, we have a United Nations, but you don't literally anywhere in the world say, what we have to do is create a more powerful United Nations that is akin to the federal government that was built in the United States in the late 1800s. So governments are going to have to work together in new ways. And in some ways, we see this in the second thing I wanted to touch upon, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is the latest form of national security and national defense issues. In a sense, if you think about the history of humanity, somewhere, sometime, somebody invented human conflict. It was on land. It probably involved a stick. And the result, I'm sure, was unhappy for at least one or both of the two parties. But over the centuries, human conflict moved from the land and then to the sea. And then in the last century, it moved from the sea and into the air. And then today, we worry about it in outer space as well. Interestingly, somewhere along the way, in ways that we really didn't think about in advance, it also spread to a new dimension, a dimension that people had never thought about before. We call it cyberspace. And so much of the activity, the hostilities between nations, happens not as acts of overt war, but acts that feel very different from what we should expect in times of peace. They happen in cyberspace. But what is cyberspace? It's interesting. It's actually different from the land or the sea, for example, because cyberspace in many ways is not really controlled by governments. Much of it is owned and operated and managed by companies in data centers or on servers by companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Google and Facebook and Apple and many, many others. But cyberspace is also somewhere else. It's in your pocket. Literally, it's probably in your pocket, or maybe it's sitting right here on your desk. It's called your phone, or it's your laptop. That too is part of cyberspace. So when you think about what it takes to protect cyberspace, it takes a different approach. Indeed, when we look at the threats in cyberspace today, I would say they fall into three categories, but increasingly they're connected, they're knitted together. There is, in some ways, the problem that affects more people than anybody else. It's called ransomware. The ability of an organized criminal organization to phish, attack, penetrate your device or the devices of institutions like hospitals and schools and municipalities and oil pipeline companies, and literally lock their computers and say that it will remain locked forever unless you pay us money. Now, even there's an important geopolitical dimension because it is a criminal act to engage in that kind of activity. And so what you see is ransomware flourishing increasingly with even syndicated financial backing of enormous sophistication, but fundamentally flourishing in countries where governments are prepared to look the other way. It would be very difficult for ransomware to exist at the level that we see it today if every government on the planet were actually united or unified in putting ransomware out of business. So you see this enormous connection from the phone in your pocket to the governments of the world. We see it in a second way, and it's even more connected to the geopolitics of our time, and that's in the context of nation-state attacks. These have become far more sophisticated. We saw it burst into the headlines of much of the world last December around the so-called SolarWinds attack, something that people now agree was launched by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency that was focused on the United States, but we at Microsoft saw victims, targets outside the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Belgium, in Spain, in the Middle East as well. And a lot of it was espionage, and of course espionage is as old as government itself. But we saw a new form of attack. It disrupted the software supply chain. What does that mean? Well, just think about software. It's always being updated. You depend on the updates to protect yourself or to get new features. Every user of every system on the planet does. And what the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency did was plant malware in an update of the Orion product from the SolarWinds company. And that disrupted the software supply chain. And so increasingly it is called on us in the tech sector to focus on nation-state attacks in many new ways, including what comes close to overt acts of war. In Ukraine, in June of 2017, there was what's called the NotPetya attack. It disabled 10% of the computers in Ukraine in a single day. People could not get their money out of the bank because the automated teller machines stopped working. In some cases, they couldn't pay for their groceries because their credit card wouldn't be accepted. They couldn't find out what was going on because the computers in the news stations stopped working. That is disruption, not just on a geopolitical, but on an important national scale. And then there's a third aspect of cybersecurity that I think has become more and more important, and this is nation-state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. We saw it in 2016 in the American presidential election, and then in 2017 in the French presidential election. We've seen it, I believe, in 2021 with vaccine disinformation campaigns, and it has become in some ways almost a tool of choice to disrupt a democracy, to sow dissent, to cause people to question even fundamental facts like who won the election, and is this vaccine safe, or does it work? In some ways, it may be far more effective. It's certainly less expensive to launch a government-sponsored disinformation campaign than it is to build a hypersonic missile. And we have some countries that have the resources easily to do both. So for those of us in the tech sector, and certainly for us at Microsoft, it's changed the role we play. I think it starts with the important role we play to detect these attacks, to let people know what's going on, to talk to customers, sometimes governments, sometimes consumers, many times businesses, so that they can take action to protect themselves. Sometimes we have to speak publicly. I would not have come here 5 years ago and say, let me tell you about Russia. I would have been, I'm from a company. We have employees there. I'm not comfortable talking about that. And yet, if we cannot detect and tell people what's going on, we cannot protect people from what's going on. And so this has become important as well. But our role goes beyond detection and warnings and assistance. It means that fundamentally we have this critical role to play. We used to look to governments and governments alone to protect our national borders. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they were not, but they were responsible for spending the money and having the fortresses or cannons or over time tanks and artillery. Well, today a lot of the defenses on which governments rely are built by companies. We have to constantly invest more to strengthen our defenses, to increase the protection of our products, and to provide new products and services that are all about cybersecurity so that customers, organizations, governments, and companies can protect their entire IT portfolio. There are many days where, interestingly, ironically, it is companies that might be the first line of defense, and when something goes wrong, we often are the first that need to respond. So that, too, has become part of our role. But there's a third part, and it really leads to this final aspect, cyber diplomacy. What is that? Well, it's different from the diplomacy of a decade ago, I can tell you that. The laws of the world are still made by governments. The international laws of the world are still made by governments. But they are made in part, only in part, but in important part, through new multi-stakeholder diplomacy that has become in some ways the essence of multilateral diplomacy. And you might think this is new, and in some ways, in most ways it is, but not entirely. If you look back at what the world learned from this horror of World War II, it was in 1949 that the governments of the world, all of them, came together in Geneva, and they adopted the Fourth Geneva Convention. As you may know, it established as a matter of international law that every government on the planet would have this not just moral but legal obligation to protect civilians even in times of war. But the governments of the world did not come to Geneva at the invitation of an international or intergovernmental organization. They didn't come at the invitation of the Swiss government or the French government or any other triumphant government from World War II. They came at the invitation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. An organization, and in some ways, in my view, that has pioneered the meaning of multi-stakeholder diplomacy literally since the 1860s. But now, fast forward, it's 2021, and think about the challenges that we're facing. Think about what the world needs. Well, part of what the world needs, I believe, as I've said, as others have said, is a new type of Geneva Convention, a digital Geneva Convention, a convention that says that just as governments must protect civilians in times of war, they must protect civilians on the internet in times of peace. That, at its core, is what a new aspect of international law would involve that builds on many aspects of current international law, going back to international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter itself, but taking it forward into the 21st century. But we've also learned along the way that we need new fora, we need new vehicles to bring everyone together. And if you look at the vehicles that have been invented to respond to the geopolitical needs of our time, I think one of the most important was invented here in Paris. It was at the Paris Peace Forum, the first Paris Peace Forum that took place in 2018. The date was not an accident. President Macron decided that on the centennial of the armistice that was supposed to be the war to end all wars, at a time when the United States was pulling back, looking in, and had a president that was not very enthusiastic about multilateralism, we needed a new initiative to move multilateralism into the future. Hence, he said we would have in Paris that November the Paris Peace Forum. And he invited ideas, one of which became the Paris Call. The Paris Call for trust and security in cyberspace. A document, a declaration that has 9 principles. 8 of them were really already well established, even under international law, or at least as international norms, one of which was new but clearly needed for our time, a principle that would require governments to respect the electoral processes and democracies of other countries and refrain from attacking them. It brought together 3 years ago, this week, tomorrow, governments and companies and NGOs and organizations from civil society around the world. And now we'll convene again this week, 3 years later, and in part we'll take stock of the progress we've made. We'll look now at the 1,200 signatories of the Paris Call, the 76 governments that have signed. We will hope that perhaps tomorrow we'll see the day when the United States government will sign the Paris Call and rejoin the multilateral initiatives that are fundamental for the advancement of peace around the world. We'll see. We'll learn more tomorrow. But in addition to that, you see ongoing progress from so many others around the world. We've seen each of the principles evolve into a community that brings together parties, not just to endorse a statement of principle, but to figure out how to put the principles into action, to share best practices and really disseminate what we can all do together. And what we started with the Paris Call was then used as a model the next year for the Christchurch Call, led by Prime Minister Ardern from New Zealand and President Macron, to address the risks of terrorism and violent extremism on the internet, to ensure that the cyber-based, perhaps even cyber-inspired massacre, the act of terror in Christchurch, New Zealand, that cost 51 people their lives, would never be repeated in that way again. And so as you all think about your future, as we all think about the future of the internet, as we come together this week for the Paris Peace Forum, I think the interesting question, perhaps the most important of all, is this: what will the future bring? You know who will decide? You will decide. It is the people of your generation during the next 30 and 40 years, as you enter careers in government and business and law and politics, work for great NGOs or a startup, you will decide where we take this. What I would say is we need you to build on what some of us have started and find new paths forward, to innovate in new ways, and to do it with the spirit of what you experience here every day. Not a world that is divided with people in 110 different corners that never talk to each other. A world that no doubt will continue to be defined by borders, but a world that brings people together, that pursues multilateralism with a spirit of multi-stakeholderism, and with the ambition that I think only a new generation of people can bring. A sense of impatience, combined, especially over time, with the pragmatism that comes with experience. But if you can learn from the past and can take it forward, then we all can look forward to the kind of world that I hope we leave to you and you leave to those who come after us, a world that creates more opportunity, more protection for all of us with this common humanity. So thank you. I'll take your questions.
Thank you very much, Brad Smith, for these thoughts and this call for action. We have the opportunity to take questions on the 2 sides of the aisle. If you're interested in asking a question, don't hesitate to move up to one of the microphones now. And if you're shy, I will ask the first, but somebody was well seated in exactly the right spot, which is excellent. I will group questions, and I will cut you off if you go over 15 minutes in your question, so be somewhat brief. Floor is yours.
To use the microphone. Okay. I will speak on behalf of the Cybersecurity Association of Sciences Po. During your speech, you raised several issues of describing the cybercrime. But the point is how to solve the issue, because cybercrime environment stems from economic undevelopment or maybe politics, internal politics, and so on. And there is also a responsibility of the company to have, for instance, cybersecurity by design. In a way, Microsoft, for instance, there is collaboration to arrest people and so on. But what about the economical development, social development? What can Microsoft do to solve the issue?
Thank you. Does somebody else want to jump? You're also well seated. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. So I was really curious about your analogy for the Geneva Convention to create a new initiative for the international governance or cybersecurity. But I'm thinking that so there are really several international standard organizations, you know, the International Governance Forum, or there are a lot. But I think I'm really curious, how do you think we can reach a consensus with a lot of the business, governments, and other organizations around the world, and how the Microsoft can take the initiative to reach a consensus to create a new Geneva Convention?
Thank you. I'll take one last question, and then you get the floor back for a first round of answers. Yes,
Good
please.
afternoon, sir. It is an honor having you here. So, having in mind the difficulties that come with attributing a cyber attack, and considering that it would be very difficult to imagine a company retaliating against the nation state, I would like to ask you, how would Microsoft specifically plan to respond if it becomes a target to a major cyber attack, and it has intelligence that show that this cyber attack was nation-state sponsored? That's my question.
Great questions. Should I start with those three, and then we'll
Yes.
work our way to the next? First, I just want to say it's great to hear that there is a cybersecurity association here at Sciences Po. Thank you. When I think about what we can do, and then I think a little bit about your question around the economic dimensions, I would offer a couple of thoughts that just build on other thoughts that I provided earlier. The first thing I would say we need to do constantly, maybe the first thing we need to do constantly, is keep increasing the protection that we provide and make it easier for our customers, organizations, individuals to deploy them. And then there's a second economic aspect associated with that. One of the really interesting aspects of all of the cyber attacks that we've seen over the past year, whether it was SolarWinds, whether it was what you might have heard of as the Hafnium attack, the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, the attacks on institutions in Europe, is that virtually every one of these could have been prevented or at least very substantially mitigated against if the organization had deployed one of half a dozen well-established, well-documented cybersecurity best practices. Things like updating your software, having anti-malware installed, having a service like the one that we or others offer to secure all of the devices, having what's called two or multi-factor authentication, so that when a password is hacked, that alone won't get somebody into a server or a device. Having something like least privileged access, which is a technique that says that if you have a network administrator, just give that person access to the part of the network they need to use, not the entire network, so that if their password or credentials are hacked, it's not all at risk. Or securing network keys in a safe place, like a hardware dongle or in the cloud. Those are the 6. And we constantly ask ourselves, well, why is it that this is so hard? And some people would say, well, it's because you'd make it harder than it should be. And that's an active discussion that we worry a lot about, in all honesty. We think about it. We think, could we turn more of this on by default? But then we have to think about, well, how much would break in legacy systems? So we struggle with that tension, and we'll continue to work on that. But the other reason, and this points to the economic issue, is that as we've written more, published more, in the SolarWinds attack we published 31 blogs, one of the things we concluded was that there just were not enough people trained to read everything we were writing. And so from an economic perspective, there is a critical workforce shortage in almost every country for cybersecurity professionals, which is a way of saying that if you're part of the Cybersecurity Association here and you have some cybersecurity skills, you're probably going to find it very easy to get a job, at least I hope so. Interestingly, we just did this in the United States. We'll do it for other countries as well. We analyzed the data and concluded that for every 2 cybersecurity jobs in the United States that are filled, there's a third one that is empty. In fact, more than 1 out of every 20 open jobs in the United States right now is a cybersecurity job. So we're embarking on new initiatives that go beyond, say, what a company would traditionally do to help train people faster. What we're going to do in the United States is partner with community colleges, provide free curriculum, training for faculty, financial assistance, and counseling and mentoring for students to try to plug that hole. And so, you take those 2 things. How do we help organizations deploy security? How do we help train people so they're in a position? And I think that captures one slice of what your question asked about. I then go to the next piece, a really good question about the Digital Geneva Convention. Well, sounds good, but this isn't 1949. We're not going to get all of the governments of the world to come together and agree on the kinds of principles that I've articulated. Although there's more efforts in the United Nations to do so. There has been 1 round of negotiations that culminated earlier this year, and a new round will start next year, and I think there's some hope. But I would point to something different. I think what we really need is a coalition of the willing, a coalition of like-minded governments that will work together to increase cybersecurity protection, and over time will establish norms that will become part of international law, even if they won't initially. And if you look at how law is really built around the world, if you look at that analogy to the expansion of governments in response to the railroads, typically today it really is collaboration among governments on regulation. And the European Union is one very good example. But now you see many examples around the world where governments are coming together. And I think if we can do that in the 2020s, we would have a much stronger foundation to enter the 2030s. So that would be the goal that I would describe. And finally, attribution and retaliation. That is a question that we have had to struggle with every day in recent years. Now, you might start, and your question did, I think rightly so, with the premise that people often start with, that I think actually was a stronger premise 3 or 4 years ago than it is today. The premise was it's hard to figure out who is launching an attack. As the world has moved to the cloud, as cybersecurity has advanced as a technological and engineering and even social science discipline, as governments and companies have shared more information, it's a lot easier to attribute an attack than it was 4 or 5 years ago. We have what we call the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center that has engineers, and they identify the attacks, and they're typically able to take them back to their source, at least with, into a country, and often to a group that has already been connected with the government. We actually have a new team that didn't exist at Microsoft 2 years ago, and it really analyzes the threat intelligence from a more traditional social science perspective. So we have people who've been recruited from governments, often intelligence communities, who are probably like some of you, people who have worked or who will work, as geopolitical analysts. And so what they're able to do is take all of the attacks that we see in a week or a day or a month or a quarter from a given country, and they're able to put them together, do data analysis with our data science team, reach conclusions that project where we think that government is likely to go next. And so, in my view, we are not and should never be in the business of retaliation. I think that would make the world a more dangerous place, not a safer place, and I leave that to governments that have the authority of law to do that. But we do have the power of our voice. That's part of attribution. That's why we do increasingly speak up. It's always easier if we can speak up with others. It requires courage to speak up. But we do have more courage, frankly, than we did 5 years ago. We use our voice more often, and then we have governments complain about it. But I think if you're willing to stand up and exercise your courage on a sustained basis, hopefully, and I think generally, governments come to understand what you're doing and why and respect that. And then governments themselves can decide what they will do. But apropos your specific question, what do we do if during a day we see an attack on Microsoft from a nation state? That's every day of our lives. That's what we see every day. And it just means that we have to continue to be and operate among the strongest and best defenses on the planet so that we're protecting our networks and our customers' use of our services. And it's why, the person who does the job like mine or elsewhere needs to have more courage than he used to have. And I think that's part of where cyber diplomacy has gone as well.
Thank you very much. I'll take a second round of questions, which will be the last. So again, be short, but do take the time to introduce yourself before you ask your question. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Andres. And Mr. Smith, are you taking any interns?
That's the question everybody really wanted to know.
No, actually, my question is, considering your background as a lawyer, how does internal policy making for a company like Microsoft work when you're launching new technologies that, of course, they're new, so basically a new legal and a policy framework has to be done. Considering now that technologies are more and more intertwined with the user itself, such as the new metaverse that you guys launched, was 2 weeks ago, maybe? Yeah, that's the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll collect, because I see more than 3 people, so we'll be quick, but get more questions in. Present yourself and then ask your question.
My name is Jake, and thank you so much for fitting us into your very busy schedule, I'm sure, this week. I just have a quick question. I'm also a member of the Cybersecurity Association. I'm one of the editors of the journal. And, a lot of the questions that you've heard so far, a lot of what we talk about in the media right now is generally related to, cyber attacks and things like that. What are we missing when we only talk about that? And as students, what should we be thinking about, as the next thing that we should be studying and focusing on?
Thank you. I'll change aisles and go over to this. Your name, please, and your question.
Hello, my name is Boris. You start by talking about regulation. 20 years ago, Microsoft was on the focus of US regulators. Now it became first market cap in the world. Can you tell us about how was the cultural changes to this comeback? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a second question from this side.
Hi, my name's Joel. I just want to pick up on your thread that you spoke about just briefly then about attribution. So we've seen attribution kind of become more coordinated across the world, increase in frequency, but doesn't seem to have really slowed large nation-state attacks. Five Eyes, NATO, EU joined in July to condemn the Microsoft Exchange attack or breach. But what do you think should be kind of the next graduation of responses if we're not really seeing a reduction in nation-state attacks following public attributions?
Thank you very much. Brett, it's your choice now. We have people still lining up, and you know your time. We are at 6 now. We can take more questions, or you can answer the ones you have. How do you?
Take 2 more, and then I'll do my best to weave together an answer.
And I will
that
take the ones who are in front of the microphone. Unfortunately, for the other, we will have to do this via for another occasion. But you can go first, and then we'll take the last question on this side.
So my question is how Microsoft can help governments, and then more general, how private companies like Microsoft can help European governments to prevent spy attacks as the ones that Snowden revealed that were perpetrated by the United States. And why should states collaborate with Microsoft instead of developing their own solutions to guarantee digital sovereignty? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question on this side.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I have a question about the global governance tools that could address cyber warfare. So one of the things that differentiates cyber warfare tools from traditional tools is how quickly they can be changed. So my question would be, is the failure to govern cyber warfare on a global scale, does it come from the fact that the decision-making is too slow? And if so, how could it be reformed? Thank you.
All right. I have my work cut out for me. Let me just look at these for a second, and I'm going to try to put them in a different order than you asked for them, so that they're in an order that can weave things together and address what you were talking about. Let me start with the one, what are we missing? The first thing I would just say, which I think is really an interesting thing that I see every day, is we're talking here about cybersecurity. But I think what we haven't really talked as much about is the just wide variety of new policy and legal fields, and they really are to go together, policy, regulation, law, that are reshaping the world of technology. And we're seeing this in many countries around the world. And there's between 6 and 10 that we're trying to track and be prepared to adapt to as more laws and regulations are passed. Definitely starts with cybersecurity. You have some national security rules that are sort of closely related, but they're also a somewhat distinct field, and those are sometimes applied to critical infrastructure. We see privacy as a very well-developed field. We see what we call a digital safety, protection of children, protection against violent extremism, protection against disinformation. That is a vibrant field. We see responsible AI, all of the laws that will govern artificial intelligence. We see laws around industrial data, meaning non-personal data, and how those need to be used. We see international trade law, especially trade law relating to digital goods or digital services. We see emerging issues around sustainability and how that will be applied to digital technology. And so there's a favorite book of mine that you don't need to read the book, you just need to look at the table of contents to get the message. It's called The History of Railroads in American Law by somebody named James Ely. And what he basically showed is how railroads led to every one of these fields: taxation, intellectual property, real property, patents, how they all change because of railroads. And I think that what we haven't talked about is just how broad all of this is going to be. If I go from that to two interesting questions that are sort of related, because they're both sort of governance. One is internal, and the other is global governance. And the thing that I would say is, global governance is slow moving, but is getting faster. And what I find fascinating is what I get to do in my job every day. It's like a really fun job because I just look at the world, and we've got all of this data, and we've got people in these 54 different countries. They're all literally sharing information on, this legislation was introduced today or passed yesterday. And what I see is almost a new world of regulation with certain countries that you might almost call regulatory great powers, and a lot of other countries that are exercising enormous influence. If you were to choose 4 regulatory great powers today, I would say it's the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, and China. And I look at India and say, I think that they might join their ranks. I look at other countries that are exercising enormous influence because they're moving fast, and they've got people in government of great ability. I look at Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, a country like Canada. Actually this year, the last 6 months, you've seen governments in Asia adopting laws faster. But what I find really interesting is that when I talk to a minister or even a prime minister or a president, they usually mention that they just also talked earlier that day or the day before with their counterpart in another country halfway around the world. So governance is picking up speed, and that's a good thing. Now that's informal, that's the world today, and I think your question points to that's interesting, maybe it's good, how do we give it more institutional support? And I think that's one of the big questions in the technology field that people will have to look at in the decade ahead. You're seeing it in certain spaces, you see it, like I said before, in the EU, interestingly in the Quad. You suddenly have the US, Japan, Australia, and India collaborating in new ways. This week, there's the APEC meetings. And so you see in the Asia and the Pacific. So fora are emerging where this is happening, and that will continue to mature. Inside a company, it is rapidly maturing, or at least it better. Because if a company doesn't mature its internal governance process, it is going to make a lot of mistakes, in my opinion. And it will pay a heavy price, either in reputation or non-compliance with laws or in some other way. We've been focused very much on that, and I'll just give you one example. We have human rights as a defined field. We have a human rights part of Microsoft. And the human rights team, and we do human rights due diligence. Before we open a data center in a new country, there is a human rights due diligence process. They analyze, well, what's the risk of corruption? What's the risk of the government asking for data in a way that will put people's fundamental rights at risk? We ask whether we're comfortable opening a data center in that country. We ask ourselves whether we're comfortable putting consumer data or more personal data in that data center. And there's a very well-defined governance process as to then in terms of how that feeds into the decision-making, and then ultimately, I'm the last decision maker that has to say yes or no on whether we're comfortable as a company doing that. And there's really a very well-established then approach that needs to continue to grow for all of the fields I just described. How do you identify the harms that you need to protect against? Then how do you define principles that you'll use to guide your decision making? How do you then architect an engineering service with technologists and engineers to protect against those risks once you've identified them? How do you put in place a standard and policies? How do you train people? How do you audit your work? How do you address compliance failures if or when they occur? And so I think this is an area in technology that is maturing quickly and needs to mature even faster. This is what it means, I think, for technology to go from an unregulated to a regulated industry. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to innovate, but we will have to innovate in a way that conforms to all of these rules and standards. And I think that goes to the next question, which I think is a really interesting one around culture. You've probably heard the adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's true. If you don't build the culture, you die. You really do. I mean, you fail in everything you're trying to do. And one of the things that we had to do as a result of the antitrust experiences we had, we were sued by many governments, not just in the United States, but around the world, was like, learn some hard lessons. And then just say, you know, we've got to change. That actually is the starting point for all cultural change. It's somebody looking in the mirror with the capability of seeing themselves not as they want to appear, but as other people see them instead. Unfortunately, most of us are not quite as good looking in the eyes of others as we hope we are in the eyes of ourselves. And if you have any doubt, just give people an opportunity to start pointing out your faults. But if you're willing to listen, acknowledge that just maybe there's something to what they're saying. And instead of responding by saying, no, let me explain why I'm right and you're wrong, and instead ask, well, maybe you're right, I'm wrong. What can I learn? How can I be smarter? How can I address the problem you're raising? That is the origin for all cultural change. And then you have to figure out how to spread it. And there's a lot of business and organizational processes that do that. Then let me take it to your two questions that sort of relate to attacks and attribution and why should anybody trust anybody, including us. The first thing I would say is, does attribution change behavior? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Does it matter? If attribution changes behavior, that's a good thing, but sometimes it won't. If you have a country that is led by a government that has a defined strategy to keep attacking others, it might not be prepared to change, but you still have to address it. And you have to address it by strengthening your defenses. And if you just look, as I'm sure many of you do in your courses here or before here elsewhere, at sort of the history of diplomacy, well, there were times when governments entered into diplomacy in the hopes that they would change the conduct of a foreign government that posed a threat. Sometimes diplomacy worked, sometimes it failed, but even when it failed, the better course was then to have a stronger defense. And so for us, we have to use attribution for two purposes. One is to try to change the behavior of governments that might be doing things that we regard as inappropriate and even unlawful and dangerous. And there's other times when we have to use attribution just so that we all understand what's going on and we can work together to build our defenses. And of course, I think that does require trust. And you know, we live in a world where trust is a very precious commodity. It's hard to build, it's easy to lose. People are quite rightly skeptical of anybody who says, trust me. If you want to earn trust and keep it, you have to prove through your deeds that you deserve it. That usually requires both conviction and consistency in what you do and transparency. And so if you look at something like, you know, how we deal with the risk of concern to some in Europe that the US government might seek their data, part of what we do is we say, we will stand up and we will defend you and we'll re-engineer our services so that your data doesn't leave Europe, it's better protected. We will stand up and go to court to defend you, and you can count on us. And of course, then people say, well, it sounds good, how do I know? And then we have transparency reports and auditing and the like. But it is a little bit of the old trust but verify approach that Ronald Reagan talked about with the Soviet Union going back to the 1980s, and we're having to apply it today. And the last answer is yes, we do take interns. We are always looking for smart people. We have an intern in the room today who works at Microsoft when she's not in class at Sciences Po. Can you raise your hand? Where is she? There she is. Go talk to her. Whether you want to work for us as an intern, whether you want to work for us when you graduate, whether you want to work for us here or in one of the other 54 countries, I hope you'll someday think about working for us. We need great people, especially great young people who go to great institutions like Sciences Po. So find out how she got the job. And there's probably something that you can think about too. So thank you very much.
We are at the end of our 60 minutes with Brad Smith. It was a real privilege to listen to you. Thank you to everybody for participating in this. Final answer was the one that they really wanted information.
That's why I kept it for last.
Yes.
Thank you. That was fun. It was great. Yeah, it's always great to see a lot of students with questions.
Yes, and they really do follow a lot of this topic. So I noticed that at the end you have already come forward in the beginning